They said she killed him with her own hands. When they dragged her into the center of town, wrists bound in rope, dress torn at the hem, and no shoes on her feet, there wasn't a soul in Grady Hollow who thought otherwise. Not because they had proof, because they didn't need it. Her name was Eliza Marris, and for 5 years she scrubbed floors, washed linens, and served quiet meals in the house of Judge Silas Grady, the man who practically owned the town. Now he was dead, slumped over in his leather chair with a fire poker beside him and blood soaked into the carpet. And Eliza was the only one home. No one asked why she had bruises on her ribs. No one asked why the doctor's records of Grady's long history of heart ailments had gone missing. They just saw her there, small, tired, silent, and decided that was guilt. The town gathered early the next morning. The courthouse smelled like pine wood and old sweat. The pews were packed. Even the preacher came, though he didn't bring a Bible, just a grim expression and a whispered prayer that no one heard. The prosecutor was Judge Grady's cousin, Martin Ellery, a man who wore his grief like armor and used his grief like a gun. "She beat him in cold blood," he shouted, slamming a tin mug on the judge's bench. This girl, this nobody, decided she didn't like the way justice lived in this town, and so she killed it. People cheered. Eliza didn't speak. She hadn't since they pulled her from the judge's house 2 nights before. Her lips were cracked, her hair tied tight, her expression unreadable. They'd taken away her dignity, but she kept her silence. Her court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Clark, fumbled with his papers. He wasn't a man of passion or fight, he was a man of compliance, and his trembling voice proved it. There's no clear evidence she struck the blow," he murmured. "Then sit down," barked the acting judge, a portly man named Hollis Reed, who had once lost a land dispute to Silas Grady and never forgot it. Now he sat in Silas's old chair, drinking from Silas's old flask. The jury, handpicked from the judge's friends and allies, nodded like horses being led to feed. No one questioned the lack of motive. No one asked why Eliza, who'd been denied wages for months, hadn't simply left, or why none of the staff at the Grady house had stayed more than a few weeks before disappearing quietly. Because no one wanted to know. Not really. They preferred their justice swift and clean. So when Judge Reed leaned forward and said, "We'll break for the night and finish this come morning," everyone assumed the rope would be tied and the gallows cleaned by noon. Eliza was taken from the courthouse under armed watch. She didn't resist. She never had. But just as the doors swung shut behind her, a black horse crested the ridge at the edge of town. Dust clouded the sky, and the bartender at the saloon whispered one name, Beckett Cain. Nobody said a word after that. He hadn't been seen in 5 years. Some said he died in the border wars. Others said he'd gone outlaw and killed a marshal in Kansas. A few swore they saw him once riding straight into a lightning storm and coming out clean on the other side. But now he was here. Boots caked in dust, hat pulled low, a revolver resting easy on his hip like it belonged there, and it did. The sheriff, standing near the edge of the square, turned pale. The last time Beckett Cain came to Grady Hollow, 3 men left town in pine boxes and no one ever asked why. He didn't speak as he passed the saloon, didn't slow as he walked by the tailor shop, where every hand stilled, didn't stop until he reached the jail. The deputy rose, startled. "Sir, visiting hours are over." Beckett looked at him. Just looked. The deputy sat back down. Eliza heard the door creak. She didn't look up. He stopped at her cell, took off his hat, looked at her face. "You remember me, Eliza?" She said nothing. "I remember you," he said, clear as day. Her eyes rose. "You said if you ever vanished, it's because no one would come if you screamed." He nodded slowly. "Well, I heard you anyway." Then he turned and left. Didn't say where he'd go, didn't say what he'd do, but the town would remember that look in his eye. And the whisper that followed him out the jailhouse door. She's not alone anymore. That night, Grady Hollow didn't sleep. Windows were shuttered earlier than usual, doors bolted, conversations held in whispers. Children were told stories that didn't end with justice, but with shadows, because Beckett Cain had come back. And he wasn't the kind of man who returned without purpose. Eliza sat alone in her cell, fingers resting lightly in her lap. The cot beneath her was nothing more than canvas on iron, and the ceiling above leaked when it rained. But her eyes weren't on the roof. They stared at the iron bars before her. Solid, silent, cold. She didn't think of freedom. She hadn't dared to dream of that in years. Since her father had been crushed beneath a collapsed mine shaft and her mother forced to trade laundry for bread, hope had become a currency she couldn't afford. But that voice, his voice, she had not heard it since she was 16. Back when she worked the stables outside of Red Basin and a young Beckett Cain, still unknown and wild-eyed, would pass through to shoe his horse or sleep in the hayloft, back when he carried a kindness under all that grit. And now here he was again. By sunrise, the saloon was full but quiet. Beckett Cain sat alone at a corner table, coffee untouched, a scrap of paper folded in his hand. He hadn't slept, just stared out the window like he was waiting for something. The sheriff entered just past dawn, boots heavy, spine stiff. "Cain," he said. Beckett didn't look at him. "We don't want any trouble," the sheriff added, voice uncertain. "Then stop making it. You here for her?" Beckett raised his eyes, gray and glassy like steel in a river. "I'm here for what's right." The sheriff hesitated. "You got no law to stand on. Law's what buried her alive. I ain't here for law." The room held its breath. "I'm here for truth," he said. And that word, it shook the saloon more than any gunshot could. Back in the courthouse, preparations were underway for sentencing. The gallows had already been dusted off, the rope tested, the platform creaked like a coffin lid as they nailed down new boards. No one questioned it. No one asked if it was too fast. After all, Eliza Marris was already guilty, just waiting for the formality of it. But not everyone felt at ease. The preacher fidgeted with his collar. The blacksmith's apprentice who once shared stolen apples with Eliza now wiped his palms on his apron. Even Judge Reed paused before slipping on his robe, staring at his reflection as though it might accuse him. At noon, the church bell rang again. Eliza was marched into the courtroom in shackles. Her hair had been brushed, but her face was still drawn, more bone than flesh. She did not cry. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation. Judge Reed cleared his throat. "This court." The doors slammed open again. Boots, spurs, silence. Beckett Cain entered without hesitation. This time no one dared speak. He walked slowly down the aisle, every step like thunder, and stopped beside Eliza. Then, without asking permission, without presenting anything but presence, he said, "She is my wife." Gasps rippled through the room. Eliza's breath caught. Judge Reed blinked. "This is a court of law." "This is a house of liars," Beckett interrupted. He reached into his coat and produced a paper. "Marriage license, filed in Porter's Crossing, dated 3 years ago." The sheriff stepped forward, took the document, and paled as he read it. "It's valid," he mumbled. Judge Reed shook his head. "Even if it is, it don't change what she did." Beckett's voice lowered. "It changes why none of you stood with her." He turned to the crowd. "You watched her suffer, heard her scream, saw the bruises, and did nothing. Silence. You buried her before the grave was dug." His hand hovered near his revolver, but not to threaten, just a reminder of who he was, of what silence cost. Then he turned to Eliza. "You don't have to speak," he said quietly, "but you don't have to stand alone either." And for the first time in years, her lips parted. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, but she whispered his name. "Beckett?" That single word cracked something in the room. Not the floor, not the walls, but the people. And suddenly a voice rose from the back. "I saw Judge Grady strike her," said the seamstress. Another followed. "He made her clean blood off his boots," said the maid. One by one they stood. The blacksmith, the cook, the tailor, even the preacher. "I knew," he confessed. "We all did." Judge Reed sat back in his chair, suddenly smaller than his robes. Beckett didn't move. Didn't need to. The truth was finally speaking, and it was louder than the law. Judge Reed fumbled with the gavel, hand trembling. The weight of silence broken had stunned the room, and now it echoed louder than any shouted judgment ever could. I must remind you," he began, but even his voice lacked the authority it had worn the day before, "that this is a court of law. Accusations without evidence." Beckett Cain stepped forward, slow and measured. His boots creaked against the floor like an old confession. "I've got your evidence." He withdrew a folded page, frayed at the corners. He held it out. "This is from Dr. Ellman, signed, dated 2 years back." The sheriff took it first. He scanned it once, then twice. His jaw tightened. Broken wrist, cracked ribs, bruising consistent with being kicked. He cleared his throat. She came in alone, said she fell. She didn't fall, Beckett said, voice flat. She was thrown. Murmurs swelled. The judge's face darkened. This is highly irregular. No, said the baker's wife from the third pew. What's irregular is ignoring what we all saw and pretending it wasn't happening. People turned to her, surprised. My son found her behind our shop once, bleeding. She asked for water, not help, said it wouldn't matter. The crowd stiffened. Their discomfort was now a rising tide, washing away every excuse they'd told themselves. She worked with fever, said the cook. He made her kneel on stones when she spilled tea, said the maid. He once made me strike her, whispered the stable hand. The courtroom changed, moment by moment, from a scene of condemnation to one of repentance, not for her crime, because there was no crime, but for their silence. Judge Reed stood, but not with his usual air of control. There's no precedent for this. We have no legal grounds to delay sentencing. Then delay it anyway, the sheriff said, surprising even himself. Judge Reed's mouth opened, then closed. He reached for the gavel, didn't raise it. Instead, he looked at Eliza for the first time, really looked. She didn't glare or weep. She just watched him with the quiet of a woman who had lost her fear. That shook him more than any threat. I'm calling a recess, he said finally, pending review of new testimony and documents. A breath escaped the room collectively. Eliza was led from his courtroom, this time without chains. Beckett walked behind her, slow and solid, as though daring anyone to come between them. No one did. Back at the jailhouse, Eliza sat in her cell, now unlocked. The door remained open, but she didn't move from the cot. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, spine straight. The deputy brought her water, his hand still trembling. He didn't speak. She nodded once. Outside, Beckett Cain stood like a statue under the eaves, eyes shadowed by his hat brim, watching the sky as if waiting for it to speak. The sheriff approached, hesitant. Judge says the case will reopen, might move it to another town, with a new jury, new judge. Beckett didn't answer. You really marry her? The sheriff asked. Beckett's eyes didn't move. No. But the license? Filed, not certified. The sheriff frowned. Then why? Because they'd believe me before they ever believed her. The truth landed like a shot. The sheriff didn't speak again. The next day, the town stirred with tension. The saloon kept its doors open, but music never played. The church bell remained silent. Even the children didn't run through the street like they usually did. Because something had shifted, not just in the courtroom, but in the town's soul, and Beckett Cain was the match that lit it. That afternoon, the church doors opened, not for worship, but for truth. Eliza was brought in, no guards, no cuffs. She walked steady, even though the floor under her feet still remembered the weight of shame. Inside the pews sat the people of Grady Hollow, the smith, the tailor, the doctor, the cook, and Beckett in the very last row, arms crossed, eyes still. Eliza stepped up to the front. She looked at them all, and for the first time she spoke. I didn't kill him. Her voice was dry, unused, but firm. I thought about it many times, but I didn't. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I stayed. She turned slightly, glancing at Beckett without turning her head. Because I thought it would keep me safe, because I thought that if I was good, someone would protect me. She looked back at the crowd. No one did. Heads lowered. Tears welled. I scrubbed his boots while my back bled. I served guests while he held my wrists so tight I couldn't move for days. I watched you all pretend not to see it. Her voice cracked but didn't break. You let them bury me, but I wasn't dead, just alone. Beckett's eyes closed briefly. Then quietly the seamstress stood. You're not alone now. The cook joined her, then the maid, the boy from the stables, the doctor. One by one. And Eliza. Eliza wept. Not from pain, but from being seen. Outside the church, clouds gathered over Grady Hollow. Not the kind that brought rain, the kind that made the air heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. Inside, the truth sat in the open, raw and bleeding, while the people stared at it for the first time. Not as gossip, not as entertainment, but as confession. The preacher stepped forward from the shadows of the pulpit, the same man who'd once bowed his head at the courthouse only to remain silent. His eyes glistened. I failed you, Miss Marris, he said softly, I saw the bruises and told myself not to judge, but that was cowardice dressed as piety. Eliza watched him but said nothing. Others followed. The blacksmith. I delivered horseshoes to Judge Grady's place and saw how she limped. I thought it wasn't my business. The baker. She came into my shop once with a torn blouse and blood on her neck. I gave her bread but not my voice. One by one, they admitted it. The town, piece by piece, stood up and laid down their shame at Eliza's feet. And through it all, Beckett Cain never moved. He just stood at the back, watching her, not the crowd. Because this moment wasn't his. It was hers. Later, in the sheriff's office, the judge's replacement arrived on horseback, a woman with sharp eyes and a marshal's badge pinned to her coat. Marshal Celeste Ward. She took the reins of the case in one afternoon. New jurors. New records requested. Old testimonies reviewed. Everything changed. Because someone from outside had come and saw clearly what no one from within dared to say. And by sunset, Eliza Marris was no longer a prisoner. She was a witness. The charges dropped pending investigation. The gallows stood empty. That evening, the townspeople gathered again, not by force, but by choice. They lined the church pews once more, this time to listen as Marshal Ward read aloud the truth that had been hidden in medical reports, staff logs, and burnt ledger pages. She held up a torn letter, found in Judge Grady's desk. The ink was faded, but the words still legible. If anything happens to me, let them think it was her. She has no family, no friends, no voice. That's what makes her useful and disposable. Gasps filled the room. The letter was unsigned, but matched Grady's handwriting. The whole town heard it. And for the first time, they didn't look at Eliza with pity or suspicion. They looked at her like someone they failed. After the meeting, Eliza stepped into the night air. She didn't know what to feel. Her freedom was not joyful. It was heavy, like trying to breathe after nearly drowning. She walked past the jailhouse. Beckett Cain stood beneath the lantern, his horse tied nearby, saddle packed. "You're leaving?" she asked. He nodded once. That was the deal. Ride in, tell the truth, leave. Eliza looked down. Her hands, still bruised, trembled. "You lied for me." "I lied with you," he corrected. She looked up at him. "You didn't have to." "Yeah," he said, "I did." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." Beckett looked at her for a long time. "Where will you go now?" he asked. She hesitated. "I don't know. Anywhere that isn't here." He looked toward the ridge where the mountains began. Plenty of road out there. Then he turned to go. "Beckett," she said. He paused. "I don't want to walk it alone." He didn't answer right away. But when he did, it was quiet. "You don't have to." She stepped forward, stood beside him. "You still got that marriage paper?" He smiled, just barely. "It's in my coat." She nodded. "Good. Doesn't mean we use it, but might be nice to keep close." He untied the horse, helped her into the saddle, then swung up behind her. No destination, no map. Just away. Away from the lies. Away from the pain. Towards something they hadn't had in years. A beginning. They rode past the blacksmith, who tipped his hat, past the saloon, where glasses were lowered and men cleared their throats, past the church, where the bell tower stood tall, unused, but not silent anymore. The town didn't cheer, it didn't shout apologies, but it watched. And in its silence was something new. Not guilt, but respect. They didn't ride far that first night. Just past the edge of the hollow, where an old inn sat crooked between two pine trees, the sign out front had faded lettering. Stillwater Rest. Inside, an old woman tended the desk. She looked at Eliza, then at Beckett, then simply said, "Room's yours if you want it, no questions asked." They ate stew by the fire, sat in two chairs not too close. She didn't speak until the bowl was empty. "I forgot what it felt like," she said. He glanced over. "What?" "To be warm and not afraid." He said nothing, but he pulled a second blanket from the bed and draped it over her shoulders. Not touching her, just covering her. She didn't flinch. And in that quiet they sat, two people no longer buried. Just tired, but alive. The sun rose quietly over Stillwater Rest. No gunfire, no gallows, no gavel. Just a golden beam cutting through the dusty windows and landing across the bed where Eliza Marris lay, finally at peace, though still not sure how to hold it. She sat up slowly, pulled the blanket tighter and watched the way the light danced across the floorboards. Beckett was gone. Not far, she knew that, but gone all the same. She didn't panic. She didn't brace for betrayal. She just waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, and there he was. A small bag of apples in one hand, bread in the other. "No coffee," he said gruffly, "but the old woman said we could boil some if we want." She took an apple and nodded her thanks. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was the silence between two people who had survived different wars in the same battlefield. "Town'll be talking," he said at last. "Let them," she replied. "They talked when I was a ghost. Let them talk now that I'm flesh again." That made him glance at her, an almost smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. She chewed slowly, swallowed. "I don't know what this is," she added softly. "You and me. It doesn't have to be anything yet. But it could be." His voice was quiet. "It could be something good." Back in Grady Hollow, Marshal Celeste Ward stood outside the sheriff's office with a stack of reports in her hand. Her coat was buttoned tight, and her boots were caked in the town's dust. "You burned the gallows," she said flatly. The sheriff blinked. "Marshal? You heard me. Tear it down and burn the wood. I won't leave until it's gone." He nodded sheepishly. She handed him the last of the statements, testimonies from the townsfolk, medical reports, witness logs. "All signed, all sealed," she said. "It's done." He watched her mount her horse. "You think she'll come back here someday?" The marshal looked toward the ridge. "No," she said, "and I don't think she should." Then she kicked her heel, and her horse carried her out of Grady Hollow, leaving behind only the sound of hooves and the sting of truth. That afternoon, Eliza and Beckett walked the ridgeline. Below them, the town that had once buried her like a secret now sat quiet and distant. "Do you think they'll change?" she asked. Beckett took his time before answering. "Maybe, but even if they don't, they'll remember." She nodded. "Is that enough?" He looked over at her, the wind tugging at her hair. "It is if you remember who you are." They stopped near a tree with thick branches and a view clear enough to see the spire of the old church. Eliza sat on a boulder, pulling her coat close. "You knew I'd be there," she said. Beckett shrugged. "I had a feeling. That day you came, why'd you step forward?" His jaw tightened, because I saw it in their eyes. The same look I saw in Red Basin before they hanged the wrong man. They wanted a show, not justice. "Sir." She watched him carefully. "You saved me." He shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I just made them look." That night, they returned to the inn. It was quiet again, more so than before. The old woman had left a note with bread and a jar of dried herbs. "For sleep," it read. "No charge." Eliza smiled faintly as she read it. Beckett stirred the fire. When the flames caught and cast dancing shadows across the walls, Eliza turned to him. "Would you have stayed if I didn't ask?" He didn't answer right away, but eventually he said no. She nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad I asked." He leaned back in his chair. "So am I." Later, as they lay under separate blankets in the same room, neither of them asleep, she spoke again. "Do you think people like us get peace?" Beckett stared at the ceiling. "Not always. But maybe. Maybe." She let the silence sit a while, then whispered, "I think I'd like to try." He didn't smile, but his hand reached across the floorboards between their cots and rested open, palm up. She didn't hesitate. She took it. Not tightly. Not possessively. Just held it. Like a promise neither of them had to speak aloud. Outside, the stars watched. Grady Hollow slept. The gallows burned in the center of town, crackling through the night like pennants made visible. And up on the ridge, in a quiet inn just beyond memory, two souls rested side by side. Not buried. Not forgotten. But found. Morning came slowly. The kind of morning that didn't push but crept in softly, through cracks in wood, through dusty glass, through breath. Eliza stood by the window of their small room at Stillwater Rest, watching the golden light spill over the hills. Her reflection looked different in the dawn. Not softer, but stronger. Behind her, Beckett stirred, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his revolver resting undisturbed on the nightstand, forgotten for once. They shared bread and apples again, like the world hadn't changed, though both knew it had. "Where to?" he asked, when the silence gave way to purpose. "Not sure yet," she replied, "but wherever it is, it's mine to choose." He nodded. That was enough. They left around mid-morning, walking side by side down the dirt trail that led away from Stillwater. The sun warmed their backs. Wind stirred gently in the pines. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Their silence was no longer empty. It was full of truth, wounds, and the fragile beginnings of something whole. Meanwhile, in Grady Hollow, the townspeople gathered again, not for a trial, not for a hanging, but for a reckoning. The gallows had burned down to ash, as ordered. The smoke had cleared, but the smell lingered, like a sermon no one could forget. Marshal Ward was gone. The sheriff wore a new look, one of humility. The blacksmith was building a bench where the gallows once stood. No plaque, no monument, just a place to sit and remember. "What's it for?" someone asked. "Reflection," he said. Eliza and Beckett reached a crossroads by noon. One fork led toward the mining town of Rust Hollow, the other toward the open plains. She stopped, looked both ways, then turned toward the wide horizon. "No more towns," she said. Beckett said nothing, but followed without hesitation. They walked into the sun. That evening they found a small homestead long abandoned. The porch creaked, the roof leaked, and the fence had fallen in on itself. She looked at it the way one might look at a broken chair, useless to some, but still capable of holding weight with the right hands. "Think it's livable?" she asked. Beckett stepped up onto the porch. "With some work." She nodded. "Good, I'm tired of leaving places." So they stayed. That night he built a fire. She swept the porch. They fixed what they could and sat on the steps with bowls of stew made from whatever was left in Beckett's saddlebags. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Later, after the stars blinked into view, she turned to him. "I still don't know if I believe in peace," she whispered. "You don't have to," Beckett said. "You just have to keep going." She reached out, took his hand again. "I'm not walking alone anymore." "No," he said, "you're not." And beneath a sky unbothered by law or gossip, grief or justice, Eliza Marris finally exhaled. Not because everything was healed, but because for the first time it could be. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or wrongly judged, then leave a comment below and let your voice be heard. Have you ever had someone step in when no one else did? Or maybe you've been that person for someone else? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the stories that matter. Because here at Stories Untold, we believe every soul deserves to be seen, every silence deserves to be broken, and every story deserves to be told. We'll be waiting for you in the next one.